It's 2 o'clock. I'm Olive Martini, and this is the Working on Wellness Radio Forum that we do the second Wednesday of every month with the Sequim Dungeness Valley's Sequim Free Clinic. And my guest today is Daryl Trowbridge. He is a domestic violence and sexual assault victim advocate and the prevention specialist with Healthy Families of Clallam County. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Olive.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this kind of work.
Okay. It's not a pretty story, but it's a real story. I grew up in a home with abuse, a lot of verbal abuse, emotional abuse, very much mental abuse, to the point where I had very little self-esteem, peppering of physical violence in that as well. And then also one of my siblings was also very angry and didn't have an outlet for her anger, couldn't give it towards our mother, who was our primary abuser, and so she directed it towards younger brother. And so 18 years of being told that I was worthless, that I was stupid. If I did something bad, it's because I was bad. That's how I grew up. And it carried over. It lasted a whole lot longer than just the 18 years. I didn't leave and then all of a sudden was better. It was a process. And thankfully, I've come out the other side, and it's now my passion to help people who have been hurt as well.
What is Healthy Families of Clallam County, and what services do they provide?
Healthy Families is a nonprofit organization. We are a crime victim organization, so we advocate for people who have been hurt. Primarily, we have been, over the years, we've been primarily with domestic violence and victims of sexual assault. We added, a number of years ago, we added a child advocacy center, which is where children can come to be interviewed if they've been physically or sexually harmed. So they don't have to go to the police department and get interviewed there, interviewed multiple times at different locations. And then just 2 years ago, I think it was 2, we started a crime victims program. So now people who are victims of general crimes, like a hit and run, or somebody vandalizes their property or something like that, they can receive advocacy services as well with us.
How prevalent is domestic violence and intimate partner violence?
Well, statistics say that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men are victims of intimate partner violence. And I think that it varies from community to community, but what we do know is that it happens in all communities. It's not just in the lower socioeconomic statuses. It's not in one race. It's all across the board. Nearly half of all men and women experience some kind of psychological or mental or verbal abuse in their relationships. So the physical side, 1 in 7 for men, 1 in 4 for women, but half of all people are going to experience some sort of emotional, verbal, mental violence in their relationships. It's 10 million victims a year. It averages out to about, in the United States, it averages to about 20 incidents of violence a minute throughout the United States. And there are 20,000 DV hotline calls a day, every day in the United States. Healthy Families alone, last year, during the fiscal year, from July 1st of 2023 until June of this year, we helped 407 individual victims of domestic violence, whereas right now we're only 1/4 of the way into this new fiscal year, and we've already helped 212 victims. So if the trend continues, we'll be at 848 victims, which is more than double what we served this last year.
What's the difference between an unhealthy relationship and an abusive relationship?
That's a good question. A lot of times we get people who don't believe that they're in abusive relationships. They think it's just toxic or whatever. And what it boils down to for me is intent. If it could be that in both unhealthy and abusive relationships, somebody is getting hurt. Usually, if it's an unhealthy relationship, it's not physical, but there can be plenty of emotional damage. In fact, emotional damage, you can have somebody who's been physically harmed, and they will tell you that I would rather be hit than have the physical or the emotional harm, because the emotional harm takes so much longer to recover from. And so I lost my track. So with the unhealthy, it's just they don't have the right tools to use. Basically, that's what it comes down to. Where the abusive, the intention is to hurt the other person. So it really does boil down to intent for me.
So when someone is being physically abused, it's obvious. There's marks, there's
Yes.
bruises. But when someone is being emotionally abused, how do you help that person?
First, that's another good question. This one, it starts out with communication and education, because a lot of people don't realize that it is still abuse. They think of abuse as the physical act. In fact, we get a lot of people that will say, well, they haven't hit me yet. That word "yet" is a follow-up. So they know that it's unhealthy. They know that it's not something pleasant, not something they're enjoying. But a lot of times they don't realize that it's more than just the physical. And it doesn't even have to be just physical. It could be restraining behaviors as well. When a person tries to leave and their keys are taken from them, that's a form of abuse, because they're not allowed to leave when they want. So it's a restraining behavior. If the person wants to leave and their abuser tells them, I will take the children. If you take the children and they become homeless, I will call CPS. I will report you as homeless, and they'll give the child back to me. Now, CPS doesn't actually work that way. But when you've got a person who's an abuser, who is very charming, who to other people, very charming and very convincing, why wouldn't a person believe that this person is capable of convincing that entity that I'm causing harm to my children and take them away from me? And so it's a restraining behavior, because it keeps them in the relationship when they want to go out of it.
What types of abuse are included in domestic violence and intimate partner violence?
Primarily the verbal abuse, and that includes mental, emotional, psychological. We just kind of group it into the same, but it can be any of those. And that one is the go-to. That's where it starts. It's very rare incidents where physical violence will happen first. So, if you were having dinner with somebody, maybe you've dated them, been on 2 dates with them. Second date, you're having dinner with them, and they get angry at something you said, and they hit you right there at dinner. You're not gonna stay in a relationship with that person. And an abuser knows they can't hit too soon. And so what they do is they will use the verbal, emotional abuse to tear the person down, to break their self-esteem down. And we tend to, victims of domestic violence, we tend to want to give the benefit of the doubt to the person. And so we'll think maybe they're just having a bad day, maybe they're upset about something else, and because we don't want to believe that the person we're attracted to.
Does the abuser always know that they're abusing? Is it intentional?
I believe it is. And that's the difference between unhealthy and abusive. Unhealthy, they don't realize. It's like, I just don't have the right tools to use. An abuser knows I am doing something to control this other person. And I will either do it with words, or I will move to one of the other ones, which restraining behaviors, like we talked about, and then the striking behaviors. And it doesn't even have to be a true striking behavior. It can be a grabbing and holding on, and squeezing, or holding on to their arm or twisting it. And so it's not a striking behavior, but it's some kind of physical pain. And then it escalates. It can escalate to sexual abuse, and it can actually escalate to the point where the abuse becomes life-threatening.
Daryl, tell us a little bit about what healthy families of Clallam County can do when they're approached.
Okay, thank you. First of all, we have an intake process, and the intake process is simply getting to know the person, finding out why they're there. Everybody's situation is different. It's interesting because a lot of the abuse is the same, but the stories are different. And so we meet with the client. During that process, we will figure out which services they are most in need of. And we don't really decide that. We help the client figure out what they need. We help them identify what their barriers are to success, what they need, and we help them figure out, what are the likely outcomes if they choose option A, option B, option C. Some of the things that we might need to work with them on is housing. We do have some housing. Unfortunately, we don't have as much as is needed in the area, but we have a lot of housing, or we have housing that we can put people in so they can get away from their abuser. Primarily, it's for people who are victims who have children, male and female victims. This is not just a women's program, because we recognize that it happens to all genders in all types of situations. So it might be housing, it might be legal advocacy. The person may say that they need a protection order and may not even know where to start. And we can actually help them through that process, filling it out, helping them turn it in. We can support them in court as well. Our first contact with a client may not even actually be at Healthy Families. It might be in the hospital. If you've ever been to the hospital and the nurse has asked you, do you feel safe in your home? We sometimes get calls to the hospital because a person has said, no, they don't. And we're grateful for those calls because then we might be able to intervene. Sometimes we get calls to the hospital because there's been somebody who's been raped and they need an advocate to be there to help them through the process. And so a lot of different ways that we get involved with the clients. Once the client is with us, we may help them with support groups. We have a support group for survivors and a great support group, great conversations. I'm a guy, but I get to be the facilitator of the group. And this last one that we just concluded was one of the best ones that I feel that we've had. Just kind of has raised the bar for future groups. And it's really about, helping people to know kind of why they stayed, the what I can do about it so that maybe I won't go back. Penny with WOW was asking, do people oftentimes go back to their abusers? And yes, the average is 7 times is what it takes to leave an abusive situation. And I've worked with a number of those clients who have returned back. And one of the things that we offer as well is non-judgmental support, because if I tell a client, if any of the advocates tell clients, I can't believe you went back to that person, why would that person come back to us? Mm-hmm. So support, encouragement, and it's really client-based. So there's no cookie cutter, no conveyor belt with us.
So tell us a little bit about why people stay in an abusive relationship.
Okay. There's a number of reasons. One of the big ones, but certainly not the biggest, but one of the big ones is lack of financial stability. It's not uncommon for an abuser to control the finances, even to get a victim into financial trouble, having them open up credit cards, and so now their credit is shot as well, and they don't have access to the funds that maybe they were supposed to be sharing. It's not uncommon if a person leaves an abusive situation for the abuser to withdraw all the money, if it is a shared account, to withdraw all the money so they have no access to it. And so if I can't afford a house, if I can't afford rent somewhere, I have to stay. Another thing is lack of support. It's also not uncommon for an abuser to move somebody from a different area where they had family and a support network to a totally new area, and to isolate them so that when they do feel like I need to get out of this, I have no one to turn to. I don't have any friends. I don't have anybody that I can really even tell my story to in the first place. And so they feel very isolated. Okay? Lack of confidence, lack of belief that it's possible. There are some abusers that say, I will find you. And they're using ingenious ways to do it. They, social media and technology. Air tags that they can put on their phones, or not on their, or tracking apps out on their phones, but air tags on their vehicles. Stalking social media, using friends in common, telling them their version of the story, which is not the truth, to help them appear like they're concerned about the person who's left, and so they help them by tracking them down, telling them where they're at, or even reaching out to the victim and saying, hey, they're really sorry. So a lot of manipulation that goes on. There's also commitment to the relationship. There are some people who get married and they really hold on to that till death do us part, for better or for worse. And sad to say, but in some cases, some faiths are very much about, once you're married, it's a sin to separate. And there's only one reason for separation, and that is adultery. Well, how does abuse factor into that? So if that's part of my value system, how do I leave when my faith says I should stay? Okay? And that's another thing that we don't judge people on their faith or on their beliefs. We try to meet them where they're at. And if somebody is telling me, that I'm a churchgoer and this is what my situation is, I can't approach them as I would with somebody who doesn't have that faith background. I have to approach them with where they're at.
What if the victim is a child?
If the victim is a child, usually that would be, it's not necessarily considered, it is domestic violence because it's happening from somebody in the home, but it's usually considered child abuse. And we can work with non-offending family members. We don't work with any of the perpetrators. There are other programs that can help with perpetrators, but we can help with any of the non-offending family members. And that's where the CAC comes in. They can be interviewed there. They can get, they're interviewed by trained forensic interviewers. And so these are people that know how to ask the right questions to get the full story. We have prosecution that comes in and listens as well and can give clues. It's like, hey, ask more about that, and so they can reduce the number of times the child has to be interviewed and make the best case possible so that hopefully maybe they can get a deal with the perpetrator so that the child doesn't have to actually go through the trauma of a trial. Because usually when it happens, it's not unheard of that it happens from a stranger, but usually when there's physical or sexual harm to a child, it's by somebody that they know and trust.
How do victims get help for domestic and intimate partner violence? What do they do? Where and how do they go?
Okay, the one way that it can be done is through social media, or not social media, but through the internet. They can go to healthyfam.org, and there are ways that they can reach out to an advocate there. They can call us. 360-452-3811 is our main number. We also have a crisis line number, so if it's after hours and they need to speak to an advocate and it's a pressing matter, not like, I need help with a parenting plan at 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday. It might be urgent to that person, but there's nothing we can do at that, in that time. But we have a crisis line number, and that's 452-HELP, so very easy to remember.
I have seen your flyers in churches, and tell our listeners where they can find the flyers that have the tear-off tags so that they have these numbers with them.
Okay. We do have some in churches. We have some in other public spaces. The courthouse is another place that we have them because a lot of people are going to the courthouse for parenting plans or protection orders or things like that. I wish that I knew the answer to where all of those were.
Well, I have seen them in restrooms, both men's and women's restrooms.
Yep.
That if you're being abused, your flyer is somewhere in that area, and there's a little tear-off tag that's got your name and your telephone number, how to get in touch.
Yep, strategically placed in the bathrooms because, if an abuser sees their partner tearing one of those off, there's going to be consequences.
Right.
And Healthy Families is located in the same building as Domino's in Port Angeles, so it's very easy to find. I tell people the address, but I just say, if you know where Domino's is, just pull in the parking lot right around the side of the building. It's right there.
And people can walk in?
Yes. Yeah. Between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. Weekdays. And, if a person has experienced domestic violence and they need an advocate on the weekend, law enforcement is involved or whatever, and they need to talk to somebody, maybe even need to meet with somebody, that's why we have the crisis line as well. There's also other programs like ours. Dove House is in Port Townsend. So maybe a person doesn't want to go to Healthy Families because maybe they believe, small enough community that they'd rather go outside of the community. Well, about 50 miles away to the east, there's Dove House, and about 50 miles to the west, there's Mariposa House in Forks. And so they're very similar programs to ours, and they provide many of the same services that we do. And then there's also the national hotline 1-800-799-SAFE.
So, if someone assumes that there's abuse going on, what does that person do? How do they either convince the victim that they need to seek help, or do they? What's the right thing to ask or to even say if you think that someone's being abused?
Okay. It's interesting because I do a presentation in one of the high school classes, and we talk about things that you might see people doing in healthy relationships. And kids will draw this, and for this one, they have to draw, and they'll draw holding hands, giving gifts, maybe even getting married, kissing, hugging. The next one is, what do people hear in a healthy relationship? And there's, I love you and you look great and all sorts of other things. The third one is, how do people feel in a healthy relationship? And a lot of times they feel loved, they feel supported. But the one thing that tells me, because you can see all those other things and hear all those other things in abusive relationships as well, safe. So one thing that we can talk to our friends about is, do you feel safe in your relationship? And when I say safe, I'm not just talking about safe from physical harm. Do you feel safe enough to express your opinion about something without fear of retribution, without fear of being told that you're stupid, without being, can you share something in public and not be worried about what's going to happen at home because you said the wrong thing in public? And so, does a person feel safe? Do they feel supported? Do they feel loved? Because you're not going to feel that in an abusive relationship.
So when people are in the doctor's office and you're there with your child and you're the abuser and your child is the victim, and the nurse asks, "Do you feel safe in your relationship?" What does that poor child do if their abuser is right there with them? How do you reach that child?
Most of the reports of childhood abuse actually come from schools, because that's where the children are going to be away from their abusers and safe, or feel safe telling somebody if they do feel safe. I've actually had a conversation with a nurse many years ago. My wife went in for a procedure, and she asked in front of me, "Do you feel safe in the home?"
That happened to my mother-in-law. I was shocked.
And so I asked the nurse, when she was done with the things that she needed to do before she left the room, I asked her, I said, "Do you ever ask the other person to leave the room when you're asking?" Because if my wife, and I told her, I said, I'm a domestic violence victim advocate. So I said, if my wife didn't feel safe, she wouldn't have answered
right
in a way that would make any difference. She's forced to. If she's asked in front of the perpetrator, she's forced to keep silent for fear of being harmed. And so that child is probably going to end up not being able to say anything other than to lie.
Right.
And that's a protective thing. It's better for me to lie than to tell the truth in this situation. And then maybe that question carries over to in the school, where the child is with a teacher that they get to know, or a counselor that they get to know, that they can open up to. And that might be another thing to educate the educators to ask those questions.
And in the case of a school situation, what kind of things would a teacher recognize that aren't quite right?
Usually it's a change in behavior. I distinctly remember in my childhood, my mom and my first stepdad, got a divorce, and I became withdrawn. And I think part of the reason I became withdrawn is because of the loss of somebody that was my dad, but also with dad out of the home, more abuse was coming my way. And so my teacher noticed and even wrote in my progress report, Daryl has become withdrawn lately. And so being withdrawn, acting out is another way. Incidentally, the very next quarter on my report card, I was 7 years old, and I learned that humor is a great coping mechanism. And so it was, Daryl has become silly lately. But even silliness, if I was normally somewhat stoic, and then I become withdrawn, and then I start acting out, even though it's not a harmful behavior, it's still a disruptive behavior. That's those are signs to watch for.
What are some of the ways we can help prevent intimate partner violence from occurring in the first place?
That is about education. If we help children, especially, build a strong foundation of what they should expect with a friendship and how they should be treated, that's going to be tremendous. I use an example in one of my treatment center presentations that I do. It's called the Relationship Toolbox. And I start off talking about if I was wealthy, I like to pretend, if I was wealthy and I promised a person in the group 5 acres anywhere they wanted to live in the United States and all the building supplies, the only caveat was they would have to use the tools that I provide for them. Would they take me up on that offer? And a lot of them are like, yeah, that would be fantastic. And they tell me where they would like to build their place and everything. And I said, so let's say you get your place and it's all cleared out. It's ready for you to start building. And you're like, wow, Daryl really came through on his promise. And you open up the toolbox and you realize Daryl is a jerk because the tools are lousy. The hammer is bent at a 45-degree angle to the side. Every tool that's supposed to adjust is frozen shut. The saw is rusted and half its teeth are missing. You're not going to be able to build the house that you want. You'll be able to build a structure, but not the house that you truly want. And it's the same thing with relationships. If we're modeling for children, yelling and screaming, if we're belittling our partners, if we're doing those types of things, that's what we're putting in the children's relationship toolbox. And we're telling them, go build a relationship. And if they've got lousy tools, they're not going to have the relationship that they want, which takes us back to what we talked about before. Abusers are intentionally harming, but if a person simply doesn't have the right tools because they didn't know what the tools were, they're doing the best they can with the tools that they have, and people are still getting hurt.
So when you talk to kids at school, you tell us about the puppets that you use in elementary school.
All right. I have been blessed. I started using ventriloquism a number of years ago, and it really works very well in the school system. It's a great teaching tool. And so what I'll do is I'll bring in a puppet, or sometimes more than one puppet in a particular day, and I'll work with the elementary grades with these puppets. And the puppets get into all sorts of mischief, and we talk about the mischiefs that they've gotten into on a variety of topics. Sometimes it's about bullying. I have a puppet that Healthy Families has purchased for me to use. His name is Leonard, and he's been bullied before. And he has a little bit of a lisp, and he doesn't have his horns yet, and so he gets made fun of. And so we talk about how does that feel to be bullied? What does that do to your desire to go to school and learn? And so we use the puppets to teach that. And so we talk about empathy. We talk about boundaries. We talk about consent. And of course, with the little kids, we're not talking about consent in a sexual way, but we're talking about consent for even hugs. What if you don't want a hug on a particular day? What if you're just kind of having a rough day? We should ask first and not just assume. And if the person says no, we should respect that. And we can teach children this at a very young age so that they can learn that I should treat others the way I want to be treated. The golden rule is embedded in what I teach, and it's in all cultures. It's not just in Christianity, but it's a principle that how would I want somebody to treat me? And if that's the way I'd want somebody to treat me, I'm going to commit to treating them that way as well. And so seeing these children interacting with the puppets and then hearing reports later on from some of the school staff that those kids were having a conversation. It was like, yeah, but Rusty said, or Wild Thing said, and whichever character I brought, the kids are still talking about it, which is another advantage because if I just went in as myself, I like to think I'm interesting enough by myself, but the puppets really do bring take it to another level, and it gets kids talking because then the kids also go home and they tell their parents what they learned in school, and so in telling, they're repeating as well. And one of my favorite puppets, another one from Healthy Families, is an alien puppet. And he has crash landed onto our planet. On his planet, everybody looks the same. Everybody is good at all the same things. They communicate telepathically, so there's no differences. But he's stuck here because he crash landed, and he's going to be here for a while. And so I bring him to schools, and I have the kids teach him what it means to be a friend, so that the other kids in the classroom hear what their friends understand. So it's not an outsider coming in saying,
You
be
must.
nice.
Yeah.
Right. It's their teaching, and they're hearing what their friends have to say about friendship. And that's the basis of future relationships. And if they can get the friendships down early, that can carry on into later life.
And do you ever find that when you're working with the children, and do you ever at some point have a child come to their teacher and say, hey, I learned something today and that's not what my house is like?
Yes, we actually have had that happen. I don't hear about it all the time, but I do hear about it sometimes. I even heard, we were talking earlier about, awareness. And I was at a school teaching one day or presenting one day, and I noticed that there was a young lady in the classroom who she looked very uncomfortable with the topic. And I try to be sensitive about that in the beginning because they're not always easy topics. And so I talked to the teacher afterwards and I said, hey, would you check in with the student? She was sitting right over here in this period. And he did. He checked in with her, and she was able to get help for some stuff that was going on. Stuff that she felt was normal. And that's a word that I dislike in this work because abuse can be normal. So I try to get people away from looking at things as normal. Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? Is it abusive? And so it does happen. And in fact, we've had a number of kids come into our CAC because of, and even though we're trying to prevent, it's that raising awareness of what is healthy and what's not healthy, or even what's abusive, that sparks that realization on their part. Because if they've grown up with it for years, how would they know that it's not okay?
So can you tell us what Healthy Families prevention work does?
Yes. So we're in all grades. We're in a number of schools throughout Clallam County. I go out as far as Clallam Bay and sometimes Quileute. And so doing presentations on boundaries, consent, friendship, communication, decision-making, empathy, those subjects that are a lot of times they're identified as the social emotional learning tools that a child needs, giving them a fun way to learn those. And even though I'm not using puppets at the middle school and the high school level, I feel very blessed that I connect with the kids. I don't have to try to pretend to be one of them. I just get to be myself, and they resonate. That resonates with them. We used to have some clients that would come in and talk with our therapist that we had on staff at the time, and he would ask them. He says, "What do you think of Daryl?" And because he's worked with kids for years, and he's like, kids know when you're fake, they know when you're not genuine. And he says every single time he would ask, they would be like, "Daryl's cool," and which to me is amazing because growing up and being a victim of abuse myself and very low self-esteem, to be called cool by a kid, that's a pretty high compliment.
What if I think my neighbor is being abused? This is an adult, and I'm not quite sure what to do. I don't want to reach out to them. Can I call Healthy Families? What happens if I call you? Do you reach out to that person? Yes, you do. I just have to turn the mic on.
So I wish that we could reach out to everybody. We can't, unfortunately, because sometimes it would actually be dangerous to reach out to that person. What we can do, though, is we can encourage the person to find a way to kind of covertly reach out to that person. And it doesn't have to be anything directly about domestic violence or intimate partner violence. It can be about, inviting them out for coffee, establishing a relationship, letting them know that you care. When a person...
This is for the neighbor.
Yes.
That neighbor to neighbor, you
Yes.
say, is there something I can do?
Right. And so even though we might not want to get involved, because we might feel like we don't have the right tools.
Right.
And that's okay. You don't have to have all the tools. But if you can start a relationship and letting the person know that you care, that is a tremendous help to that person who feels isolated and alone. And realizing that person may actually not say that they want a friendship right now simply because,
It's embarrassing.
well, it could be embarrassing, but it
Yeah.
could also be, I'm going to get flack from my abuser for spending time with somebody that they haven't approved.
Okay.
And so there's a lot to this. And so the main thing is taking the lead from the other person, doing something nice for them, showing them that you care with your time, with your, just reaching out and just, how are you doing today? And then letting them get to the point where they will talk about the abuse. And then when they say, I need to talk to somebody because this is going on, maybe that person the neighbor can go with that person, bring them to Healthy Families, provide a ride for them, or provide a phone so that they can come over to the house because maybe their phone is being monitored. And so they can use their neighbor's phone. So there are a number of ways, but it takes time. And it's a very tricky situation. And we really have to take our lead from the person who we're concerned about.
So you talked a lot about love. What are some other healthy relationship essentials?
Communication. I think that's the biggest one for me, and not just because I like to talk. Communication, if it's done well, leads to understanding. And understanding is huge when it comes to knowing how to treat our partners. My wife, and she knows that I share this story, when she's upset about something, and it's not about me, but when she's upset about something and she wants to cry, we've been married for 36 years. She doesn't want to cry in front of me. She never has. And because we've talked about it, because I understand where she's coming from, I don't force her to hug me. I give her space because I know she needs it. I want to hug her. I want to hold her and tell her it's going to be okay. But because I understand her, I give her space. And then when she's ready, she allows a hug. I have never once tackled her and forced her to receive a hug because and I know this because we talk and we talk about everything. Communication is also really important because even if it's not about communication, if it's about honesty or trust or respect, how do we deal with that if we can't talk about it? And so communication is huge. Honesty is also important. And everybody is told little white lies. And sometimes we even do it to save somebody's feelings from being hurt. I think more often than not, we tell it because we don't want to get in trouble. But even telling a little white lie with good intention can backfire and damage trust. So the only time that dishonesty is really allowable in a healthy relationship is if you're planning a surprise for somebody. It's like planning if you're going to propose to somebody and you're at the jeweler picking up the ring and your partner calls you and says, "Where are you at?" I don't expect that you're going to tell them, "I'm picking up the ring." You're probably going to make up a story. And then later on, when you propose, and that person's like, "Wait a minute, were you lying to me? Were you really there?" And they're not going to throw the ring in your face because you lied to them. But if you lie about other things, it will damage the trust. And so honesty, best policy.
During the break, you talked about gut feeling, when you know that something's not right.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. It is not uncommon for people to come in and say something to an advocate along the lines of, "I knew this wasn't the right person for me. There was something about them and I just pushed it away. I knew in my gut that this was not the right relationship, but I told myself that I was being silly or I was being stupid, and I talked myself into something that turned out to be abusive." And that's something that I really want parents to instill in their children at an early age. If there's a gut feeling that you get, listen to that. It's there for a reason. And you don't usually find a person saying, "I listened to my gut and I really regret it." It's always the other way. And so trusting that gut feeling. So we have to have some trust in ourselves even in a relationship. It is two individuals that are united, but they're still individuals. And so we have to be able to trust ourselves and trust that our partner is going to be respectful and supportive.
I think what you said during the break that really meant a lot, made a lot of sense to me, is when you said, my abuse was not my fault. It was my abuser's fault.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, shame. shame is huge with people who have been abused, both physically and sexually, and because there's a lot of stigma about it. And nobody wants to go around, walk around saying or wearing a big shirt that says, I'm a victim of domestic violence. That's the kind of stuff that we usually keep to ourselves. And part of that is because of the shame and the stigma of it. And the only way to really overcome that is to talk about it more. And if we can help people get to the point where they understand the shame of the abuse is not on the victim, it's on the abuser. But here's some of the ways that shame transfers to the victim. When somebody says to them, why didn't you leave? That puts the blame back on that person, just as much as it says to a person who's a victim of rape, oh, well, why did you wear that outfit? And so whenever we're talking to somebody, we have to be very careful that we don't put that shame on that person. They already feel enough shame. And so if we can help liberate them from that by letting them know that was an intentional act by another person. They did that to you against your will. So the shame is on that person. And so when I tell my story, and I don't tell it very often, but when I do tell my story, people are surprised that I am free and open with what I tell. And I can tell it because the shame belongs to the people who abused me, not on me. I was a victim, and I was taken advantage of.
Can you tell our listeners how they can get involved in helping and supporting healthy families so they can continue to work with victims?
Absolutely. First of all, money.
Money You're pays, a 501c3.
Yes, thank you. We are a 501c3, so we are a nonprofit, and so we get a lot of our funding from donations, from government contracts, et cetera. And so if people have money that they want to donate, we even had years ago somebody who left part of their estate to us because they really believe in the work that we're doing. So money is very helpful because we can use money for just about anything, especially if it's non-specific. If it's just for prevention, then we can't use that if somebody needs housing or if somebody needs to travel out of get out of the area. And so if it's undesignated funds, then that's beautiful. But if a person doesn't feel comfortable donating money, gift cards are fantastic. Prepaid cell phones and minutes, that's another way that you can help our clients directly. Non-perishable foods, pool passes, movie tickets. Sometimes people that go into are escaping from domestic violence, they don't have money to just throw around. We've got to go to the Winter Ice Village last year. My wife volunteered, and she got 2 tickets for volunteering. And we ended up with more tickets than we needed, and so we donated. And it was like, these are $10, $15 a pop. That's something that a person who's maybe staying in our shelter can't afford. So think about the things that you like to do. And if you like to eat at McDonald's or Subway, donate a Subway gift card or something. We can pass that on to the person. So that's one of the ways, is by giving something tangible that way. You can also volunteer. We have a transitional housing program called Rose House, and beautifying the place. It's already a beautiful place, but beautifying the grounds is another way. If you have organizational skills, we have clients that need help with organizing. My boss would probably tell you, not on the radio, but she would tell you that organizational skills would be helpful for me. Somebody coming in and taking care of my office. But if somebody likes paperwork, they don't want to necessarily deal with clients, but they want to help with filing and stuff. Those are great opportunities. Somebody who can drive people. Maybe they have my grandfather years ago. That's one of the things he did. He drove people that needed rides. And so there's a lot of different ways, including even fundraisers. There's Marin Welch. She does a thing called Rise from the Ashes. This is the 6th year, and it's a fundraiser for healthy families, and it's coming up on the 19th. I get to go and talk about healthy families. I get to do a little bit of poetry, and I get to bring one of my puppets for first time for this venue. But it's a fundraiser, and so if there's a fun run that you're doing, and one of the easiest things you can do is like and follow Healthy Families on Facebook and Instagram. And when we post things, share that, promote it, like it, so that you're getting the word out to other people that are in your friend circles, so that domestic violence doesn't have to be that dirty little secret that nobody wants to talk about. It brings it into the light.
I want to thank you so much for coming in. The Dungeness Valley Health and Wellness Clinic is the producer, I guess you could say, of the Working on Wellness Radio Forum. They are one of 32 free clinics in the state of Washington. The clinic is open to the public on Friday and Thursday evenings. The doors open at 4:30 and no appointments are necessary. The SQM Free Clinic serves everyone who has no health insurance or is underfunded by their health insurance policy. They're located at 777 North Fifth Avenue, and Healthy Families are located next to
Same building as Domino's in Port Angeles.
Domino's in Port Angeles. Thank you so much, Daryl, for coming in. I think we reached some people today.
Thank you, Olive, for this opportunity, and thank you, Penny, for the opportunity.
You're welcome.